This is late in the year 2014. I'll be 90 within a couple of months. I was born in 1925 in Munich, Germany. I was brought up as a single, only child. My father was a textile broker, my mother a homemaker. And we had a fairly standard middle-class life till about 1933 when Hitler took over the German government and started his rant against anything Jewish, which of course we were. And after a few years after my father had lost most of his business, he realized that he had to leave the country, and he did so by going to various consulates, trying to find out where they had openings, where he could get a visa to emigrate to whatever country would accept him. There were not many countries that were forthcoming as far as wanting any refugees. And as he made the rounds to the various consulates, he hit the Argentine consulate in Munich and was told that no, they would not accept anybody there in that country. However, they had heard that the American consulate had a quota system, which if my father had the interest, he could sign up for and get a quota number, which would permit him, once the number was called, to apply for a visa. The German quota system at the time was 27,000, the second highest of all countries that the United States would accept people from. England had the highest, 36,000.
How big was Germany at this point? What's the population in Germany? I don't know what that means.
This was based, the number of people that the U.S. would accept was based, they claimed, on the number of immigrants that had come to the country prior to 1924. It's debatable whether it's true, but I think the main reason was that they picked the various numbers is to have Anglo-Saxon types as the predominant number of people immigrating to the States. So England was tops, Germany was second, and way down in the list was Poland, which they only accepted 800 people. So I guess I was lucky. In any case, our number came up in 1939. We went to the consulate in Stuttgart and had a physical there, which was very important because the U.S. would not accept people who had any sort of sickness or any handicap. We passed with flying colors and were told that our number would come up sometime late that year, 1939. As it turned out, sometime in the early spring, my father got a call from the consulate saying that somebody had dropped out who was supposed to come to leave for the United States before the vacation started. And was my father interested in taking his family earlier than he had initially planned? My father was more than happy, and we actually left Germany on early in July 1939, something like 2 months before the war started over there. My father was ready to leave Germany as early as possible. He was able to get to England on a temporary basis and a temporary visa. And when he went there 2 months before we left the country, we flew, actually was the first airplane ride I've ever been on. We flew to Rotterdam from Munich. And at that point, we stayed with a family that my father knew for 2 or 3 weeks. and left Rotterdam on the New Amsterdam, the Holland American Line ship, which went first to Southampton, where we picked up my father, and the three of us came to the States on July 23rd, 1939. I like to go back a bit because there are certain things that happened that I still recall. All this was, from what, in retrospect, from what I can tell, fairly successful way of life, and it lasted basically till Hitler came, and at that time made it very difficult for anybody who was Jewish to, number one, earn a living in Germany, or for that matter, stay there for any length of time. My mother was a homemaker. My father was a textile broker, and we did all right till the government, the German government, basically took all the business away from Jewish people, and basically also made it clear that they wanted to get rid of us. At that time.
And what year is this approximately, if you had to guess, when you started seeing these signs?
The Nazis got in 1933, and the anti-Jewish laws were largely promulgated in 1935. And at that time, it became almost impossible to have any sort of business. And by 1936, 1937, my father had lost all his customers, because they were told they could no longer deal with any Jewish businessman. And at that time it became very apparent that he had to leave the country, which at that time was still the main interest of the German government, just to get rid of Jews. As far as the final solution came, that was not till 1942, when they decided, well, at that point there was no more immigration because of the war, and the only way to get rid of Jews was to kill them.
So were there, signs posted, or how, no one was marching in the street saying, don't patronize Jews. It was done quietly, or it was done out in the open and said in so many words? How was it said?
It was, Jews were persecuted basically by constant propaganda. Nazi bigwigs, starting with at the very top with Hitler and Goebbels, kept screaming at every occasion that it was the recession, the depression that we had in the 20s, the lost war, the First World War, was the Jews' fault. The international financial jury had forced the Germans to capitulate after the First World War, and therefore they had to be removed from the Germanic race. His number was due to come up in the fall of 1939. And after Kristallnacht, which I think was November 11th or 9th, I don't remember exactly the date.
And that's when they marched on their own people.
When the Nazis burned down synagogues and and smashed in storefronts of Jewish businesses, and my father was arrested and put in a concentration camp with most male Jews that they were able to round up. Thank God they did not come to our school, so I was totally unaware of what really was going on till I heard that my father had been arrested and was in a camp.
When you heard he was arrested, were you in the Jewish boarding school still?
I was still, but this was in the fall of 1938.
And they come?
We had basically a slot reserved for us late in 1939, and by, as it turned out to be our luck, the people who had an earlier appointment to get out and get the visa stamped had to drop out because, for some reason, which I never heard of why, couldn't meet the deadline. And so the consulate asked my father or my mother, I don't remember which, whether they would be willing to, or would be capable of filling that slot that now had opened up. And my father said, yeah, I'd be more than happy to do so. And so it turned out we were damn lucky, because the war started in early September, and we got to the States on the 29. So we would have been caught in Germany if we had to wait for the slot. I visited up the famous estate that Hitler had up on the top of the mountain, which was completely bombed out. And within a couple of weeks, we were sent to a Austrian resort spot, which the Germans had used as a recovery hospital for badly wounded soldiers. And our job, and our team job, was to discharge German prisoners, which we did. And my job was to see whether they were automatic arrest cases, which meant they were either some special stormtroopers, or they were often SS, which was the Himmler's private army. And the only way you can tell that was by looking whether they had their blood type tattooed in their armpits. So my job was to look at soldiers' armpits to see whether they had the tattoo. I never found any. But I did this for 3 weeks, and then they said, that's it. The division is now going to Auxerre to train for the incoming invasion to Japan. So we flew to Auxerre, middle of France, and that's when I took my training as a glider rider. I had a choice. I could either jump or glide.
And so what happened to intelligence? You were done.
I was still part of the intelligence group. The team, they had 2 teams in the division. Each one had 6 people.
Okay.
So the 101st Airborne had six of us. By the time we went to Auxerre, there were only 3 or 4 of us left.
in the intelligence wing.
Of the
Now,
group,
I forget how big divisions are. How big is 101st? That's
the division is about 8,000 people.
so.
But usually a division had one interrogation team. 101st had two because usually they get so scattered when you jump or when you glide that they felt they needed more to distribute them. So we had two, but by the time we got to Auxerre, there was only about three left. And the division started training. And I had to make a choice at that time, since I was a part of the division. They said you either had to jump or to glide. I had a choice.
And you knew that your role was changing because the division's role was changing.
I was part of the division.
And
it was an airborne division. You jump or you glide.
And they were moving on to other places, and so you
And
had.
the division itself was training to go to Japan and invade them. I don't know what it would. I don't think they would have taken us with us, assuming the war had lasted. But anyway, at that time it wasn't clear what the hell was going to happen. And between that time, all we did was I did translations of the war conferences that Hitler had with his general staff. It was quite interesting, that work. And that was also the time when I had my famous court-martial. I was court-martialed for damaging government property. What had happened was that each of these two teams had two jeeps. No, had one. At that time, we had only one jeep per team, but for the two teams there were only three people left. And I didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't drive. I had never driven a car before. So one team was just parked in front of the headquarters building, and the other one was driven by the other two guys. And one day, General Maxwell D. Taylor, who was in charge of the 101st, came by and saw the Jeep rusting away, flat tires, and said, "Who belongs to this Jeep? Why isn't it being taken care of?" And they came back and searched the record and said it belongs to 81st Interrogation Team. Who's in charge of the interrogation team? Well, there's only one person left, and that's Private Frank. Court-martial that man. Court-martial Private Frank. And I was.
Private.
And they scared the hell out of me. They said, admit guilt, and that saves us a general court-martial. No, they want me to plead. And so, what am I going to do? I said, okay, I'll guilty as charged. So they said, fine, 2 weeks restriction to the base, which meant nothing, since the base was the town, and you have to clean up the Jeep and make it runnable, and you have to clean machine guns for 2 weeks, which I did, and I learned how to drive a Jeep and clean it, and gave it primary maintenance. It was just after the war was over, and we were one of the first ones of the Americans that got into Berlin. It was just walking around. It was just like a battlefield. It was not cleaned up yet. There was the tanks were standing there, half-burned. Equipment was lying all over. Bomb craters were all over the place. It was just like a movie set where the actors had gone home after shooting a battle scene. 46. And I still remember there was a lot of chutzpah on my part. I walked in someplace in June after being a buck sergeant for about 2 months and said, when am I going to get my 4th stripe? Because a supply sergeant is had a staff sergeant rating. And he said, "You're not getting anything, you're going home."
When I was 15, December 7th, 1941 began, and we eventually put in 16 million troops. In high school, in our junior year, some veterans came to our high school and took tests to see who would qualify for being a pilot or a gunner. 2 years later, we were called to prime duty. We enlisted. And from there, we went down to Fort Devens for processing, then took a troop train to Biloxi, Mississippi for basic training. And from there, I went to, I was in Biloxi in August, in the summertime. I went to Madison, Wisconsin in the winter. Spent 6 months in Madison, Wisconsin, and training to be a radio mechanic. From there, I went to Chinook Field, Illinois for electronics. From there, I went to Boca Raton, Florida for radar. So all that time, it's probably spent about a year training to be radio connected. When I get overseas, what do you think they did with me?
Radio and all that other stuff, sir?
Put me in the control tower. Nothing to do with what I've been trained for. So, elaborate.
Yes, sir.
And so I was in the control tower for P-47s. But to go back, when we left New York with 8,400 troops on the boat, ship. While we were on the deck, the infantry guys were in the lower part, and we, the Air Force, were going to be in the top part of the ship. So the infantry guys yelled out to us on the deck, "How come you flyboys ain't flying over?" A New Yorker with us said, "How come you doughboys ain't walking over?" So anyway, 8,400 of us landed over in Le Havre, France. We were there in Paris, near Paris, for a couple of weeks. Then we took boxcars. You know what those are?
No, sir.
You know what a freight train is?
Yes, sir.
Those are boxcars.
Oh, okay.
So I had 40 of us were in there with straw and one big box of rations. 3 days and 3 nights. We rode on that. You know, no facilities. So on the way, we were going through France. The French people would be out there begging for candy and stuff. And when we got to Germany, the Germans would be there like this. They would not beg for it, but they would take it if we'd give it to them. Anyway, we landed in, well, it was all devastation. When I got there, it was November 1945. There was nothing but, I remember in Frankfurt, I looked up on the hill, and there was only one church left standing. Everything else was just completely demolished. Then I went to the Fritzlar Air Base. I spent well, a year there. And, a lot of things happened, you know. There was a cadet that just graduated and was flying in the P-47. He was flying, and he couldn't get one wheel down. So I talked to the lieutenant, and I talked to him, and they talked to him. You could tell he was upset because he was all choked up. They told him to fly over the Oder Sea, drop his wing tanks, come back and put the other wheel up and make a crash landing on the grass. So he was coming in, and the lieutenant said, "You're doing fine, you're doing fine." All of a sudden he put the coal on, he chickened out at the last minute because he was afraid. And the lieutenant said, "Well, you better land this time because you won't have any gas." So he did. He landed on the grass strip. Beautiful landing. The propellers all wrapped around the cowling, but he made a nice landing.
How did your military experience affect you?
It made me grow up. I was 18 when I went in. I matured. I can tell you, I was probably naive when I first went in. It matured me. It was probably the greatest thing for me. I had one while I played basketball with a lot of the officers, but I never got a bond with them. They didn't bond me. I was an enlisted man. But there was a friend of mine who lived in Orange, New Jersey. We got together a lot after the war. We talked on the phone. We've done that up until about 5 years ago. I don't know what happened.
What was it like being deployed overseas in Europe?
Well, I was away from my family. The only communication we had was by mail. We didn't have what you have today. So when we came home, it wasn't like it is today. With all the flags, all the banners, all the stuff. The only thing we got when we came into New York Harbor was a fireboat. Threw some water in the hand and sent an alarm on. And the Red Cross girls greeted us with coffee and donuts. But when we got home, there wasn't any big reception or anything for it. And all this, thank you for your service, never started until probably 10 years ago. As I said, I was more mature. And I was able to relate to people because of all the GIs who were in there with me. We related to them and did this experiences around the country. So I grew up. After the war, I ended up at the Brunswick Naval Air Station, which was a part of the University of Maine at the time. I slept in the barracks like I did when I was in the service. We went to classes. And then I went to the University of Maine for 4 years on the GI Bill. And that's where I met my wife. We got married. One episode I'll tell you about was this P-47 is a pursuit fighter airplane. And two of them were out one day and they're flying, I don't remember the name of the mountain, over some mountains. And one of them, they said to each other, I'm going to make a right turn and go back to the base. You make a left turn and go back to the base. Well, the guy that made the right turn and came back to the base, the guy that made the left turn never came back, and they never knew what happened to him. This was in the fall, till the spring, that following spring, when some German lumber people found him sitting in the plane in the woods. You know, trees had all fallen in behind him, and hit his head on the skull. That was, I remember the letter he came through to his wife. And that was moving, very moving. But we had a lot of stuff that happened on the runways. You know, they overshoot the runway, they undershoot it, they go through the fence at the end of the runway, they go off the runway with a flat tire. The ambulance is coming up the runway, and we've already cleared another one. The ambulance is about ready to run into a P-47. Well, that kind of stuff. I'll tell you another one. We just cleared a P-47 for landing. This Piper Cub came out on the runway, did not go through any procedure at all, and started down the runway. So here's the P-47 coming like that. So I took out a flare, red flare, bounced down, almost hit the wing on that on the Piper Cub. The guy on the P-47 had trouble. He was almost down too far. He put the gas on, but the plane shuttered, and he finally got off. Base operations said, whoever's the pilot in that, get him back in here and we'll want to talk to him. So he was in there for about a half an hour, and he came out and went through the most formal procedure of a takeoff. and took off. So a lot of things happened, but I can't tell you all of them. I'd have to say we all did. Not just an individual. It was good. I'm very proud of the fact I was in the service.
And I enlisted in November of 1951 and was in until November 1955, the Navy Air Force.
Where did you go for your training?
I went to a place called Bainbridge, Maryland. And Bainbridge was a Second World War training camp for the Navy. It was a temporary structure. It was built during the Second World War. They needed a lot of veterans because of the scope of the war. And these buildings were put up as temporary structures. They had 2x4s for framework and then clapboards. No sub walls or insulation. The guys were sleeping along the outer edges. Their clapboards had cracks in them because they dry up and the windows didn't fit. You'd wind up with snow on your blankets. It was a very bad situation, you know. But I left there, then went to Jacksonville, Florida, for Navy, what they call A&P school, Airmen Preparatory School, for 2 months. Big difference from Maryland. It was nice and warm and beautiful. It was great. I was called an AT, Aeronautics Electronics Technician. Radio, radar, ECM, electronic countermeasures, everything to do with electronics in airplanes. Things as they come. I really enjoyed my 4 years in the Navy. I was in the Navy 4 years and never went aboard ship. From Bainbridge to Jacksonville, Florida, to Memphis. I went to Alameda, California, and was assigned to the Alameda Naval Air Station. And I flew for 2 years in the Navy. I love flying. In fact, Bob Dempsey probably controls all the airplanes. He was an air traffic controller. But it was quite nice. I really enjoyed the service. I never saw any action. From Alameda, we flew to Kodiak, Alaska. Going to Kodiak, for me, was a real nice experience. Because ever since I was a kid, I was always interested in Alaska, and I've read Klondike Fever, Call of the Yukon, Jack London books, and I was all excited about going to Alaska. The rest of the crew had just come from Japan, the previous year, and they were hoping to go back to Japan, wine, woman, and song. They were all, we gotta go to Alaska. And I was happy, So we wound up in Alaska. And it was everything I thought it would be, wild, beautiful up there. And in Alaska, we flew from Kodiak down the Aleutian Chain to a place called Adak. Adak is closer to Japan than it is to America. We used to pick up Japanese broadcasts. And from Adak, our main mission was to fly up along the Siberian coast, trying to locate Russian radar stations. And that was the bulk of my duties while in Alaska, trying to locate, because you were the Cold War between Russia and America, like it is now, only it's much worse now. But we were trying to find Russian radar stations. And it was called ECM, Electronic Countermeasures. Very, very, very boring job, because you sit at a scope and you have to watch the screen go around. And the Russians did not have radar stations like we do. We have our radar stations going around, and you could detect the station very easily because the signal kept coming back every time. The Russians had manual, they would sweep your plane once with one sweep, and you'd hear a bah, and that was it. And you'd get a little signal on the scope. And if you got within 10 or 20 miles of where the radar station was, that was doing good. Well, one time, I got a signal, and the pilot got excited when I'm recording it, and every 20 minutes, half an hour, I'd get another signal. We got back to Kodiak after a week on the Aleutian Islands. I got up to the commanding officer's office. He said, the commander wants to see you. And I'm what they call a white hat, an enlisted man. I said, oh God, what the hell did I do? So I went up there and I walked into the conference room, and all these officers were sitting at this table, and geez, they're gonna court martial me, they're gonna shoot me and do something. So they wanted to know about this radar signal, because nobody had gotten one in years. So like I said, it's most of the guys would sit there and doze off. I mean, but being the kind of person I am, I wanted to see what was going on. I found a station. They interrogated me. They had me play the tapes back for the sound. Why didn't I get better directions? So that was pretty exciting for me at the time. All the time I wasn't excited, I was scared. Yeah. When I got back in 1955, things were very, very poor, economically speaking, in the States. I got a job working for John's Manville Company. It's asbestos. They made asbestos ceilings and floorings and stuff. And I worked there for about 6 months. And I applied for a job at Sanders, which was just coming into Nashua. I was employee 486. In the Navy, I have to back up a little bit. In the Navy, the planes we were flying in were P-2Vs. They were patrol planes, anti-submarine warfare, ASW airplanes. And in the planes, they had these things called sonotubes, sonobuoys, I should say. And if you detected a submarine, you drop these sonobuoys and try to track it. You drop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and by the sound you could tell where they were going. Everybody who worked on the P-2V hated the sonobuoys, because you had to go into the hangar and get the rack of sonobuoys. They were big things, big rack of 24 of them. We had to what they call jiffy test them to make sure they were working properly. Then go to the plane and unload them into the tubes in the airplane. Then after the flight, you take the sonobuoys out of the airplane, put them in their racks and put them back in the hangar. It was a real pain in the neck. We hated sonobuoys. I got to Sanders Associates, and guess what job they wanted me to do? Working on sonobuoys. I said, holy crap. It has a lot of perils in it. Just, I mean, you figure a plane weighs tons and it's flying. It shouldn't be able to do that. We had adventures. One time we were flying off the coast of Siberia and we lost all electrical contact on the plane. The inverters went out. And if you're flying off, like, every country has barriers, how close you can come to their coastline. I forget what the distance was, but I used to be a radar operator also. And we were flying about 10 miles beyond the danger zone of invading Russian territory. And so the navigator had to pick up on the spot what's called dead reckoning. You know, I mean, dead reckoning is flying pretty much by the seat of your pants. You know, you don't have any radar contact, you don't have any radio contact, your LORAN is out, everything's out. And he had to fly that plane, or navigate the plane for about half an hour. And that was because if we wandered over into Russian territory, there was an air base in Siberia. You could see it from Alaska. It's 30 miles across the straits there. One of our planes did get shot down in 1955, but that's a whole nother story. And yeah, we had a fire on board the plane one time, and we were flying navigation hops. One of our engines quit. You know, we were flying with one engine. So that makes things exciting, and you know, being young, 21, 22, wow, ooh, you know, so it was, you know, it was great. It was great.
I was in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. I wasn't there the whole time. I was there for 14 months. I grew up in Boston, and the interesting story there, I went to a prep school that prepared us to go to either Boston College, Holy Cross, and I was fortunate to be selected in school. But my brother, who was a World War II veteran, he said, join the service, see the world, find out, it's great, meet people from all around the country. He said, you can always go to college, get the hell out of Boston. That's basically what he said. And he was a hero himself. So I joined the service, went into the Air Force. I went to San Antonio, Texas, a beautiful city, and it was called Lackland Air Force Base. That's where they had their basic training for new people. And it was a 14-week course. And the worst thing I did, I got there in August, where all the gnats were ready, and they couldn't wait to get in my ears. They were looking for it. So that's what happened. Then I graduated there, and I went to a lovely city called Biloxi, Mississippi, and went to become an air traffic controller. And it's amazing to realize back in 1950 that you know, you talk about the stuff about black versus white, but I saw in Biloxi, Mississippi, a water cooler. It said whites only. Couldn't believe it, whites only. And my buddy and I went in a bar to have a couple of beers, and we had the Boston accent. So they said, we don't serve Yankees in here. So welcome to the South.
So what kind of bonds did you form between fellow airmen?
Brother bonds. Really, as my brother said, meet people from around. And the interesting thing is, too, the Air Force became an intensity bond in South in 1968. Prior to that was the Army Air Force. So President Truman says, no, you're going to be out for your own. And my squadron, where I went to basic training in San Antonio, we were the first one to have 4 black guys in our organization. They finally integrated the Air Force. And that was a great experience. It changed your thought of what it is. People are people, no matter what their color is.
Yes.
And we, air traffic controllers formed a close relationship because you relied on each other to make sure everything went well. And it was good. Well, I'll tell you how I got deployed. When you graduate Biloxi, they said I was going to go to Japan because the war hadn't started. This was in April, May of 1950. So I had a nice, I was just telling my friend here, I had a nice train ride from Boston to Camp Stoneman, which is out near San Francisco. 2 weeks to cross the country on a train. And here now you can fly there in 4 hours. But I happened to get on a local, so I saw a lot of the world. So that was one part of the deployment. And the second part was interesting, was a 13-day trip by boat from Seattle to, San Francisco to Yokohama, Japan. That was my deployment to Japan. And then when I got to Japan, we took a rickety old wooden seat train from Yokohama up to my base, which was called Misawa, Japan, which was the last Air Force base on Honshu, Japan. And I thought I was going to settle in there for 2 years. And I remember my uncle telling me to learn the language he did. He was deployed there after World War II. So I started studying Japanese. And guess what? The Korean War broke out, June 25th. So the next thing I know, September, they said, you're deployed to Korea. So that's how I got to Korea. And I was in the, what they call the Pusan perimeter. On the map, you could see something like that if you had a chance to take a look. It was the last place before we were going to be pushed out into the city. So it was very interesting. During the war, I had some, during the war I was deployed to a couple of small, what we had to do is use a radio jeep. I have a picture of the radio jeep here, if you're interested in looking at it. Instead of a Tahoe, we had a radio jeep, and we drove up the north again, coming out of the Pusan perimeter. But before that, just to let you know, Al Jolson gave us a tour, and you probably never heard of Al Jolson.
No, sir.
He was a big movie star, and he was the first one to come over and entertain the troops under the USO program. It was fantastic. It really was. So in the meantime, we drove the Jeep up, opened up small air evac fields. Air evac meaning emergency in case, and when the wounded would come in, they'd haul them out of there on small airplanes. So we did that. And when I got up to Wanju in January of 1951, a little bit of background about the war, just so you'll have an idea. I don't know if you studied it or anything, but Wanju was taken over again, and that was just southeast of Seoul. That's when the Chinese come in December of 50, November, December. We had a small air evac field up there, and I had the responsibility to work a DZ. Are you familiar with that expression?
No, sir.
DZ means a drop zone, and where we drop equipment down to help the troops. So we had 3 drop zones that day. And it was pretty interesting. The first drop zone was food. I can remember all this because we even helped get the stuff together. But it was food, the second one was ammunition, and the third was medical supplies, dropped by big cargo aircraft. And I directed them to the field where they dropped. And as a result of that, I got this medal. It was very cold. Those gloves helped out. It was 20, 25 below zero. And we gathered the equipment that was dropped by the Korean people helping us. They were willing to help because we paid them. So they collected all the food and the ammunition and the medical supplies. Because where I was a field called K-46. It was like one of those emergency air evac fields. And that's where a hospital was. Well, the rest of it, they really gave me a good conduct. I said, wait a minute. And then the other one here is occupation of Japan. And this is another good conduct. And this was a blue. One is two battle stars, because I was in 2 battles. And this is the Korean, these last 2 are the Korean ones that they gave us. Plus the Korean government gave us some others too. I have a few more over there that were given to us at a later date. This is called the Peace Medal. The Korean government started giving that to the veterans who are over there. And this, I got this the 60th anniversary of the Korean War. And I happened to be in Korea at the time. That's another story. This was an honored one. When we were going north, we saw the refugees coming south. Now, if some of you have seen the refugees of the Iranian deal, you've seen that? In Korea, they were coming south, and the kids were carrying things on their backs, on the top of their heads. That's all they had. They were getting away from the war. And that stuck on me. Well, I grew up. I grew up from a wise-ass kid from Boston to still a wise-ass kid, but we'll get more information. I didn't mean to swear, I'm sorry. But I grew up, I learned a lot about other people, not only Koreans, Japanese, but even my American people that I met. That was very important. It showed me a lot what life was like. Now the war started in 1950, and the South Korean government still honors our veterans every year. They recognize what we did for their country. They sent us jackets. One year they'll send us sweaters. They'll send us different things, and they still have a respect. Like I got the book on the 60th anniversary. I was fortunate to be one to go to Korea on the 60th anniversary, which was 2010, I believe. And my grandson, 19-year-old, came with me. And he was a student at UNH, and his professor said, it was in October, and he said, go ahead. He said, to come back and you're going to give us a PowerPoint of what it was. And he said, fantastic. So it was quite an honor, and they still do it today. I'll give you a background. During the COVID stuff, they sent me 5,000 masks. The Korean government, I'm the commander of the Korean War Veterans Association, here in New Hampshire. So the first group, they sent us 45 boxes of 300 each. The second time they sent a year later was 5,000 of them to distribute to the veterans or anybody else.
And they were at
There it is. It's better than a 9.5. If you need one, I'll be glad to give you one, just so you know it. Better than the blue. That's what it's like. So they always take care of the veterans. They still do it. They still do it. You know, it's amazing. And this Korean Society of New Hampshire have a dinner once a year for us up at the Boscawen Veterans Cemetery. They provide the whole meal. They give us gifts and everything, recognizing the Korean War veterans. And as I said afterwards, shall I tell one more story?
yes, we're in.
To talk about what it did in my life. Do you, are you familiar with air traffic control? Do you think it's just a control tower? And they control the airplanes off the airport?
Yeah, that's what I
That's
thought
it,
it was like,
right.
sir.
Well, right here in Nashua, it was moved up in 1963. The Boston Air Traffic Control Center, which sits off exit 4, between exit 4 and 5. You ever see a big building over there if you go by it? That's where people control the airplanes over the 6 states here, upstate New York, over New York, and 500 miles over the ocean. They're sitting there watching radar, controlling airplanes. That's where I worked. And so, I worked before that at the one in Washington Center. They have 31 across the country. So remember this, the next time, Dylan, you take off Manchester and you're heading for Vegas, there's somebody in National New Hampshire controlling that airplane. Then he hands it off to New York, Cleveland, Denver, and so forth. And you're at 35,000 having your fourth martini. And the reason I bring it up, and I won't talk much longer, I know you're busy, but one of the nicest things that happened to us at the control center, we've had a lot of things happen. I can tell you about UFO reporting, if you want to know about UFOs over there, people seeing them. But in 1981, do you remember the Iranian hostage incident? Did you ever read about that?
I've heard a little bit about it.
Where the Iranians in 1980 took over the embassy, American embassy in Iran, and at the time the president was Carter, President Carter. Well, he tried to rescue them by a couple of helicopters, but they had an accident. Well, anyways, they took all the hostages and moved them from the embassy into prisons. So, because if we try to rescue them, they wouldn't be able to get them because they're different prisons. In 1981, President Reagan was reelected, and they released the hostages. And 62 of them came home. And the interesting thing about it, we controlled that airplane. We were the first ones to greet them when they exited the United States. Think about that. You're right here in Nashua, New Hampshire, and contact. And the aircraft's call sign was Freedom 1. Every aircraft has a call sign. Are you aware of that? You know, if you get on American Airlines 420, that's what the controller calls American 420. If it says Jumbo 22, we call it Jumbo 22, whatever they want to call it. So it was such a thrill. I've got some paperwork here to show you if you're interested in it. And the most interesting thing, and I keep it to my friends because I've heard this story, the most interesting thing, the pilot, when he crossed the border, the controller of the center, Frank Bednazar, He had a great voice, so we wanted to make sure he was the guy that did it. He said, "You now entered in the United States of America, 80 miles north of Bangor. Welcome home." And that's something. And we played into the aircraft, "America the Beautiful." And so they all could hear that. And then the pilot came back and said, "There's not a dry eye in the airplane." And Frank, the controller, said, "There's not a dry eye in the control room." It was quite a thrill, quite a thrill. Now to finish that off, I like to talk, I'm sorry. I hope I don't screw you guys up.
No,
okay.
not at all.
But the pilot, we found out later, well, we were always getting calls, where are they? We couldn't tell them because they were going to Newburgh, New York. They weren't going to Washington. Newburgh, New York is where West Point is, and they have an airfield there because their families were going to greet them there at that time. And the article that I have for you is kind of interesting, but we didn't know at the time, but the pilot of that aircraft was actually one of the hostages. He was a colonel in the Air Force. He was the air attaché at the embassy, and he asked to fly the airplane in, and they said okay. So that was a thrill. 2014, now figure this, 1981, 2014, I met that man in Phoenix, Arizona. And I don't know whether you should take this or not, but I'll tell. Should I?
Go ahead, we can edit it later if it's not appropriate.
He and I got to talking, and the reason I met him is when I was going to Phoenix for the winters, and I was interviewed by a Korean woman, American Korean, about my Korean experience, like we're going on now. And also I told her about the incident of the Iranian hostages. She said, "You won't believe this. I was at Arizona State University yesterday, and there was a man telling the same story. And it turned out to be that colonel." So she put me together with Tom Drescher. And he and I were talking. I got pictures of it. And I said to him, how did you survive? Well, he could speak German and Farsi. So they didn't know it, and so he could talk with them. But he said when they had moved them from the embassy into the prisons, they had had a shower in a couple of months. So he and this other guy were going to take a shower. Well, I guess the Iranian people don't believe in men hugging each other, shaking hands, or I guess they have something about that. So guess what he did? They had the camera on him because they're watching him. He's in the shower. He mooned them. He mooned them. When he told me that, I couldn't believe it. It was just come out. He mooned them. So he went 90 days in solitary confinement, and he said it was worth it.
I was going to jump the cord and I
Okay,
could not
okay,
let you do
Oh,
that.
don't jump the cord.
All right.
It's okay.
I'm so sorry to do that.
So I just can, what?
I'm ready. Are you ready, sir?
Okay.
What advice would you give Dylan, who is going into the service? What advice would you give him?
Don't do it.
16 million of us.
Yes, sir.
It's a lot.
It is a lot.
Most of them are kaput now. You understand that?
No, sir.
Coat. Speak German?
No, sir.
Speak Russian?
No, sir.
Almost died. Almost died was it. You understand that?
No, sir.
Jak się masz?
I don't understand that either, sir.
Dobrze.
He has the no sir down.
What do you speak?
I'm learning Spanish now, but that's not going so well for me.
¿Cómo está?
Estoy bien. Too.
What do you speak?
Just English, sir.
What's your history?
Portuguese.
It's almost Spanish.
Almost.
Be all Zinzi.
I don't understand that, sir.